Here are 10 things that Americans find, well, weird about European homes. Number 1, the laundry situation. Having a washing machine next to your pots and pans in the kitchen or sometimes in the bathroom definitely makes us Americans do a double take. Most homes in the US have a dedicated laundry room or a utility closet or a garage or something that the washer and dryer are kept in. Now, for many European homes, a washer or a combo washer and dryer is in the kitchen because that's where there is already some plumbing and electricity to be able to extend to the washing machine. Not only that, but so many homes in Europe don't actually have a dryer at all. Or if they do have one, it's smaller and it's used for washing their bed linens and things like that. Whereas in America, we're used to shoving like a cargo load of clothing in there and having it done in an hour, as opposed to hanging it out on lines inside or outside the house. It's something that used to be more common, but I'd say as a standard, we're pretty much accustomed to using our washer and dryer to do all of our laundry all the time. Number 2 on our list, no window screens. This is a big one. In America, we have screens everywhere on every window. We're just totally accustomed to that because we don't want to deal with flies at all. Mosquitoes in particular, house flies, anything like that. But in Europe, you'll be hard pressed to find any windows with screens in them. Now, in a lot of places, we found that you don't actually need screens because there's not really an issue with bugs. And in other places, it feels like, man, you really need some screens in here because there are bugs everywhere. So regardless of whether you think they should or shouldn't be there, for us as Americans, it just seems weird not to have that. This is as good a time as any to acknowledge the fact that trying to encompass all of Europe in one list is a little bit rough, right? It's kind of hard to put all of these different cultures, languages, histories, and different people into one bucket. So I fully acknowledge that. And to all of my European friends, if there are any corrections that need to be made on this list or experiences that you have that are different from what we're talking about here, feel free to leave those in the comments to educate both me and the rest of us watching. Number 3 on our list are plugs and switches. These are very different for us when we travel to Europe because there are so many things that are different compared to what we're used to. Now, I'll be the first to admit we are the odd man out when it comes to how we measure things using the imperial system versus metric, as well as the fact that we use 120 volt for so many appliances in America versus 240 volt, which is used almost everywhere else in the world. Our plugs here are called Type A for the grounded and Type B for ungrounded. Europe, on the other hand, uses a whole host of plug types depending on where you live, with the Type F or Schuko plug being one of the most common, at least outside the UK and Ireland. You're also going to find Type C, Type E, F, J, K, and L plugs, almost all of which are actually compatible with the most universal Type C. Great Britain and Ireland, for example, use Type G, which is a pretty great plug for a lot of reasons. So much so that I actually made an entire video that you can check out right here about why that is such a great plug. That said, it's not the different types that we Americans find pretty odd about it, but how they're actually grouped together, and the fact that you might find a light switch and a plug and then a separate light switch all in the same plate in the same box. Not only that, but we also consider a lot of these light switches to be upside down based on what we're used to. We're used to hitting the top of the switch for the lights to turn on and the bottom to turn off. And here in Europe, it feels like it's just kind of whichever way you want to do it. Most of the boxes in Europe seem very compatible or interchangeable with different types of plugs, different types of switches, different types of connections, even audio-video connections. I've seen boxes that are used for controlling your thermostat up and down with switches, as well as coax, Ethernet, phone wires, anything. I mean, you name it, you can put it in these different boxes. And in most cases, you can put 3 of them side by side or 2 of them side by side, depending on the configuration of the box. And it doesn't help that we have these boxes around that actually have 3 different blanks next to each other, and they all look very similar to a traditional light switch. In my video that I did on British plugs or Type G plugs, I received tons of comments saying that the Schuko type is superior and is by far the best plug out there. So I've considered this a couple times, making a video about the Schuko plug versus the Type G plug versus the American plugs. So if that's something of interest, let me know in the comments. But this is a pretty interesting one right here. Number 4 on our list is no central air conditioning, and in some cases, no air conditioning at all. Now, this one makes perfect sense given the fact that there's a lot of buildings here that have been around for hundreds of years, and they predate not only the central air and that kind of thing, but also electricity in general. So a lot of things had to be retrofitted, and it makes sense that you're not going to be able to necessarily pipe in the vents and the registers and all of that sort of thing. But one thing that we do see tons of here in Europe are mini splits. If you're not familiar with mini splits, they are super common outside the United States, and it's basically just an external condenser unit and then an internal head unit that are connected, and they can provide both heating and air conditioning in one unit, but they are limited to a certain room typically, or maybe a couple of rooms at best. These are everywhere in Europe and they're super common, but another common thing is just to not have air conditioning at all. And for us in America, at least, that's a pretty strange thing. There are very few places in America that don't have air conditioning. I know I'm pretty spoiled. Like if it's 73, 74 degrees, I'm like, let's turn on that AC and get it just to that right comfortable room temperature the way we want it. And going right along with that is the lack of ceiling fans. I hardly ever see ceiling fans in Europe. They're very uncommon, whereas just about everywhere in the United States has a ceiling fan. Not sure what it is or why that is, but definitely something that I miss seeing and miss having, just that air circulation in the room that comes from having a ceiling fan. On the topic of mini splits, I had the chance to install a mini split in my wood shop, and man, I love it. So if you are interested at all in learning about that and how easy they can be to install, and I'm not going to say it's like super easy, it's definitely something that will take you probably a full day, possibly more, but it's totally worthwhile, so much so that I'm going to be doing one in my new shop, which is coming along nicely, a much larger mini split, and that will give me full control of heating and air conditioning in there. You can check out more about those install videos right up here. Number 5, and this is in some ways the biggest one for me, and it includes both the homes and everything outside the home, but in my opinion, and I think in most Americans' opinion, everything in Europe is tiny. I found this pretty fascinating chart that shows the different home sizes or average home sizes based on different countries. In the United States, you can see we have a fairly large average home size, but check out the different countries in Europe. None of them come close to the sizes of homes in the United States. We simply have huge houses. Now, what's interesting about this is that Europe has more than twice the amount of people as the United States, but in a geography almost the same size as the United States. So twice as many people per square mile, as it were, and as a result, they've had to make adjustments and learn to live in a smaller space. So for someone like me, at least, it feels like everything here is tiny, and that goes for their kitchens and their beds, the appliances, the cars, the elevators, the streets, the toilets, the washing machines, the cars, the garbages, the refrigerators, the cars. Did I mention the cars are tiny? And everything else, except, of course, the flush buttons on their toilets. So that leads us into item number 6 on our list, and maybe it should have been item number 2, but the large flush plates on their toilets, they're absolutely huge, and their toilets and bidets are something that we're not used to. Just to have bidets in general are definitely an abnormality for us. They're becoming a little bit more common in the United States. We've had one in our house actually for a couple of years. Now, the other thing about the toilets here in Europe is that there are many different kinds, whereas in the United States, we typically have one general pattern, which is the tank on top of the toilet bowl. Here, you often find either an internal cistern, meaning the tank and all its components are actually in the wall, or maybe a raised cistern where it's up above and then it uses that extra gravity to cause a little bit more pressure as the water comes down and flushes a little bit better. The reason for these huge plates that we see everywhere here in Europe, for example, is because that's how you access the internal cistern or the tank and the different components. There you've got your flush valve, you've got your float, you've got your water supply. All of that is accessible by removing the plate, which is pretty easy to do. And then you can just unscrew a couple of pieces, a little bit of plastic, sometimes some screws, sometimes not. And then everything is actually accessible within there, which is pretty handy. Now, this may or may not fly ever in the United States for various reasons, but it's definitely something that's pretty common. The bidet is so common in Europe, for example, that here in Italy, at least, it's actually part of their code. There's actually a code that came out in 1975, a decree, and it said, in each house, at least one bathroom must have the following fixtures: a toilet, a bidet, a bathtub or shower, and a sink. The bidet seems like a pretty polarizing kind of thing. My son, for example, is afraid of them and doesn't want to go anywhere near them. My buddy Roger Wakefield, the plumber, he says he actually has carried them around on vacation with him to make sure he has one with him.
And I carried a bidet toilet seat with me and installed it in my hotel room.
I have not seen that.
So, up your game, brother.
So let me know in the comments if this is something that you're a big fan of or you're not a big fan of. Love to hear your opinion on that. Speaking of plumbing, number 7 on our list is garbage disposals or sink disposals. I grew up always using a garbage disposal, always putting food down the sink. That's just totally normal for me, and I think for most of the people that I associate with in America, totally normal. Here, you're very rarely ever going to find a garbage disposal. Food here is typically taken and scraped into a garbage or into an organic compost bin of some sort, and it's either thrown away or it's turned into compost that can be used by farmers or in the back garden. Now, that does happen occasionally in the United States, but it's way more common for us to actually include everything in the waste that we put down the sink, flip on the garbage disposal, let it get rid of everything, and we're done. Number 8 on our list are doorknobs in the middle of the door. This is something that we're definitely not used to in America because we always have them next to the actual latch, next to the mechanism of the door. I saw a pretty funny comment that said the doors in Europe are like hobbit homes, where you expect to see them in the middle of the door. Now, personally, I kind of like the way that they look. It's symmetrical, it looks nice, it adds a little more flourish to the door. But let me know what you think about doorknobs being in the middle of the door. Speaking of doors, that's number 9 on our list. The doors and the locks here are so much more robust and, in my opinion, interesting than the doors and locks that we see in America. A lot of times they feature different hardware than we're used to, like the hinges, and then the keys themselves feel totally different to us. I mean, check these things out. The old style keys are often still in use, whereas in America, we just have our standard cut keys for pretty much everything, and honestly, they're pretty boring. One place we stayed at in Rome could have easily passed as a vault door, complete with 8 locking pins. Pocket doors are seen way more commonly in Europe, as well as some of the huge solid wood doors from 200 or 500 years ago, and those are still in use today, which is pretty awesome. So many cool doors here in Europe, and they seem to have so much more character and history than a lot of the kind of plain and boring doors that we have in America. So that's something that's weird to us, but in, I think, generally a good way. Love to see these hardwood doors and ones with flourishes and embellishments and carvings and different things like that. Number 10 on my list is this right here. That is a sound we're not used to hearing in America. The construction of the homes is, of course, completely different, and that's a whole ball of wax that we could get into. And why it makes sense the way that they're built. But for us, we are definitely not used to these super solid masonry-oriented walls, where they are typically built out of bricks or stones or concrete, and then they're faced with concrete typically, and they have that smooth hardness to them, and there's nothing happening here. There's no knock, really. It's just totally solid. We're used to timber-framed walls with drywall on the outside, and there's a hollowness to them. Even if they're insulated on the inside, they still are what we consider hollow, and they have a certain knocking sound or feature to them. These walls here are completely different, and this is especially impactful on our interior walls, like around your living room, your bedroom, your bathroom, things like that. So that's one that's very different for us, where everything seems super solid, and that's a good thing in general, but it also has this kind of cold, almost sterile feel to it when we're used to the wood timber sounds and kind of the different acoustics that we have from the different walls in America. All 10 items on this list, they have pros and cons, both to the way Americans do things and the way Europeans do things. I totally recognize that. I think it's pretty awesome to be able to come to different countries and to experience their different cultures, their different way of doing things, and the different layouts and different features of their homes. Now, if I missed anything or you have some things that stood out to you that I didn't include here, love to hear about that in the comments below. And if I made any mistakes on this, which I'm sure I've made a few, feel free to correct me down there in the comments below as well. If you enjoyed this video, you might be fascinated to learn all about what makes the Type G British plugs so brilliant. And I can tell you there's a few things that were very surprising to me about how well thought out those particular plugs are. So be sure to check that video out right here. I'm Nils with Learn to DIY. Thanks for watching.